All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening for our documentary screening of the film Behind Closed Doors, The Dark Legacy of the Johns Committee. I hope that you had an opportunity to check out some of the exhibit that we have on display right now related to the Johns Committee. This documentary was one of the research resources that I used when I was working on the exhibit. And we're glad to be able to help people remember that this is something that happened here in Gainesville, even though it's not a happy part of our history. So thank you to the Pride Community Center, both for your help putting the exhibit together and also for your partnership tonight for this event. So we are going to go ahead and start with the film screening. The film itself is about 28 minutes, and then we will have a discussion with the filmmaker and also led by Tamara from the Pride Community Center, so that we can kind of digest what we have seen and kind of talk about ways that it might be relevant still today. So we are really thankful to our sponsors. Visit Gainesville, Alachua County. We're grateful for their ongoing support for the Matheson History Museum. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We want to make sure that this is as safe as possible for everybody here. So if you can keep your mouth covered, keep your mask over your mouth and nose the entire time, so that we can all be safe. So thank you, and I'll go ahead and dim the lights and get the film going.
Monday, January 19th, 1959. I came home from school dead tired and fell asleep. The phone woke me up at 6 p.m. It was somebody or other most politely inviting me to appear before the Charley Johns Committee right away. I went. They were busy for about an hour, and then my ordeal began. After about an hour and a half, they were through with me, and my life work was in shambles. I was guilty of not measuring up to what I was supposed to have been. I carried my secret, I thought, well concealed. Oh, but why to burden you with all this nonsense? Maybe you don't even want to read the rest, knowing now the scarlet letter branded upon me.
We feel that there's no doubt communist people are behind a lot of this race agitation, and that we hope that we can stop it if that's possible, let the people know just what's what, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may.
During the 1950s, many white Southerners feared that communists were conspiring with blacks to end white supremacy. The United States Supreme Court's 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, making segregation illegal, only intensified those concerns.
My present inclination is to call an extraordinary session of the Florida legislature to cope with this ruling.
In the mid-1950s, Florida lawmakers like Charley Johns only had to look out their office windows in the state capitol to see what they believed to be the hand of communist agitators. Blacks in Florida, like others throughout the South, had taken to the streets to boycott segregated bus service.
During the activities that took place, the Tallahassee bus system basically is put into bankruptcy. What begins to happen then is that the legislature thinks it's time to act. And in August of 1956, they go into special session to deal with the issue of segregation. One of the things that came out of this session was the creation of a committee called the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee.
Conservative Northern Florida lawmakers were nicknamed pork choppers by newspaper reporters because they were good at bringing home the bacon in the budget to their respective districts.
They didn't want to put a lot of money into the growing urban areas of the peninsula. They didn't want to expand higher education opportunities. They also wanted to maintain certain customs and traditions, such as segregation. And anybody who questioned those types of activities jeopardized their political career.
One of the most influential pork choppers was State Senator Charley Johns, a railroad conductor and banker from Bradford County. Johns had been Senate president and became acting governor in 1953 when Governor Dan McCarty died in office. Johns served as governor for less than a year. He ran unsuccessfully in 1954 against fellow state senator Leroy Collins.
My record in the legislature is an open book. I have always represented the little man in the state legislature.
After losing to Collins, Johns returned to the state Senate, hoping to propel himself back into power. His vehicle was the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, which would soon become known as the Johns Committee.
During the late 1956 and early 1957 period, what the committee does is it tries to associate the activities of integrationist groups, especially the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, with some type of a communist conspiracy, basically trying to say that by questioning the social arrangement of segregation, you are violating the laws of Florida.
The committee began to hold hearings around the state, the bulk of them in Miami. Charley Johns questioned blacks about their involvement with the NAACP, but the NAACP refused to cooperate.
I want to say that the way the witnesses defied our legislative committee when we was down at Miami was simply ridiculous. And I feel this committee should go back down there and call those witnesses before us to testify. And if they refuse, we should put them in jail and let them stay there.
The committee's attempt to intimidate blacks in Miami had failed. Now Charley Johns would find a new target.
Looking back at it all, I just smile a bittersweet smile. But while I was living under it, it was not easy. I shuddered whenever the phone rang, but I threw myself into my work. I don't think I gave better lectures in my life. The intensity of imminent disaster seemed to sharpen my wits. I wrote some of the nicest and some of my dearest letters. Feverishly, I tried to finish everything.
Gainesville is a university town and proud of its close relationship with the Southeast's largest institution of higher learning, the University of Florida.
Charley Johns believed he'd found the state's greatest threat at the University of Florida.
So then I guess they decided that all homosexuals must be communists or something like that. And Mr. Johns, Senator Johns from Bradford County, had the idea that they would go after the universities because that's what might be the quote-unquote hotbed of homosexuality.
In the summer of 1958, Johns told Chief Investigator Remus J. Strickland to look into alleged homosexual activity on the University of Florida campus. He hoped the findings would convince lawmakers to extend the committee's funding and power.
I heard people were telling me that they were allowing the university police to come and take professors out of the classroom, which I couldn't believe that was happening.
The committee hired University of Florida police officers to help them investigate and interrogate witnesses.
In those days, that was before Miranda, and it was not necessary to advise anybody of their rights, so nobody was really given their rights. They were just asked to come to the police department. They really were asked in such a way that they really didn't have much of a choice.
Here's a scenario of what might have happened. Somebody who is known to be an employee of the university, maybe a professor, might have went down to the Alachua County Courthouse to use the restroom while he was downtown on business. If he was in the restroom stall for a period that was considered too long by one of the surveillance members of the Johns Committee, he might be called in for questioning. Others were called in for questioning based upon the clothes that they wore, sometimes based upon what students said about the instructors, that they thought the instructor was not acting normal.
This is an unfortunate impulse that comes on you, and I don't know what stimulus. And then you have to, well, relieve yourself if you do, and quite often you don't, and it goes away, and that's that. I knew this was bound to happen sooner or later.
There's a personal dimension to a lot of what happens. There's a professor at the University of Florida who had been the chair of the geography department since the mid-1940s named Sig Dietrich. Dietrich was well known throughout the academic community, well respected at the University of Florida. He was called before the committee because he had, according to one professor, was known to tap his foot when he went into the men's room stall. Well, after the committee had interrogated him and basically left the man in shambles, they told him to act normal as ever.
I had to execute my plan. I went over to the church, and in my blind arrogance, I argued with God that killing myself is a necessity and cannot be a sin. This settled, I went out to school. I had the aspirin there. I took 85 of the damn pills and met my class. When I finished, I ran upstairs. I climbed up and looked down on the cold, wet concrete sidewalk. I turned yellow. I could not jump. The aspirin started to act. It dulled my senses. I went back to the office. I got home somehow.
A few hours before Dietrich attempted suicide, University of Florida President J. Wayne Reitz met with him. Dietrich described the meeting as the 20 minutes that finished my life. Reitz forced him to resign.
Gainesville, Florida, a friendly city of over 50,000, where the key to good living hangs on everybody's key ring. Located in north-central Florida, the city enjoys the state's mild climate. Yet, seasonal changes are apparent, and each spring it is one immense bouquet.
In the spring of 1959, many faculty members at the University of Florida were aware of the Johns Committee's investigations, but were careful about how they discussed it.
Of course, there was a certain amount of talk about who is being fired and who is being terminated, and the joke was that if you were going to quit anyhow this spring, don't, because people will feel that you're going on this account.
UF President J. Wayne Reitz took office in 1955, the same year Charley Johns returned to the state Senate. The two men corresponded through letters before the Johns Committee investigations began on campus. Johns often sent notes of gratitude to Reitz for letting him park in his driveway during University of Florida football games. Once the investigations had begun, Reitz and the administration began feeling pressure from Johns and his committee to cooperate.
When Charley Johns or one of his representatives called up President Wayne Reitz and said, "We're coming down to investigate," you didn't have a lot of opportunity if you were President Reitz to say, "I don't think so, we have principles of academic freedom to uphold." Because if you were to raise a lot of cane about that, you might find your budget very seriously harmed in the next legislative session.
But some faculty felt Reitz could have done more to guard the university faculty and students.
As the president of a university, I think it was his responsibility and his duty to his students and faculty to protect them against unwarranted invasions of their civil rights. Forget academic freedom. Just call them their free speech, their civil rights, their human rights, their equal protection.
Being administrators within the state law, we had no alternative except to counsel these people and counsel some of them out of the university.
In a letter to Reitz, Charley Johns praised the University of Florida president for, in his words, all the dirty work that had to be done on campus. Reitz, fearful of public perception, claimed that the majority of the faculty members terminated from the university had been on staff prior to him becoming president. Reitz also wrote that he intended to pay careful attention to the moral character of future applicants.
As a matter of fact, I'll be the first to admit that I thought that anyone who was a homosexual was a complete aberration.
Gainesville has definite advantages for both industry and residents. Local young people can get top-quality college education living right at home. Just being a college community makes a youthful, vigorous atmosphere.
The Johns Committee also went after University of Florida students. Because of the committee's allegations, more than 50 were expelled.
First semester I started on my 25th birthday. The first year was very uneventful. The early classes are fairly simple and fairly easy. I was, because I'd been in service first, I was 4 years older than most of my classmates. I was standing with some friends in the Burger House, which is right on University Avenue across from my dormitory, chatting and having a few beers. And during the course of the evening, one fellow came up to me and nudged me, and I think he took me aside and whispered in my ear. He pointed out a man sitting at the bar, and he said, "Watch out for that guy. He, I think, is some sort of government investigator." I didn't know what the investigation was about. All I had to hear were those words, and the terror began. The bay window up here, on the second floor, was my room. I used to sit up there and watch for Tileston. Basically, we spent most of our time in the dorms because we were afraid to leave. Tileston used to hang out in the hallway here, right here on the second landing. And I ran into him many times. I don't know what he expected to find.
If I was looking at it through the eyes and ears of a suspect, I think they would have perceived it as a very grim atmosphere, like they've been trapped. They were never offered even a glass of water. They were told they had very little choice but to talk about this. If in fact they didn't, it was going to become public knowledge because they were going to be arrested and charged.
Walking across campus that day, I was fully prepared to hear the dean tell me that I was terminated from school. The dean asked me to close the door behind me, which again was terrifying. And he looked at me with a very, very somber look on his face, and he said, "I'm sorry to tell you I have some bad news." And he paused, and again my heart was pounding. He said, "Your father died this morning." I remember standing there thinking, "Oh, thank God, that's all it is." And I had just a tremendous sense of relief. My father was dead, but my life wasn't ending.
Investigators paid closest attention to homosexual men because they were seen as sexual predators trying to lure young people into homosexuality.
They were concerned about homosexuals, homosexual men. And so that's where most of the press was, that's where most of the attention was. But that doesn't mean that women, either lesbians didn't exist, or it didn't mean that they didn't face problems, and some problems which were unique to lesbians.
First of all, they pull out very personal, private things that nobody has a right to know, never mind these total strangers. And then they seat you in such a way that they can loom over you and be really physically menacing. And then they make all of these threats, you know, the life-ruining, family-ruining threats.
The Johns Committee had set its sights chiefly on the University of Florida, the state's largest school. However, investigators also searched for homosexuals at the other state universities. Julia Penelope was a student at Florida State University. She and Merrill Mushroom were lovers at the time.
I was terrified for Julia while it was happening because everybody knew she was a dyke. You know, she was so out, I was terrified for her.
I knew what was going on in Gainesville, and I suspect everyone else did too. But we went to Miami, we had spring break. Merrill said, "They'll be waiting at FSU for you." And they were. And they started hauling students out of classes.
Most students never realized the extent of terror their classmates faced.
I was terrified. I think it was the first time I realized that I could be stepped on like I was a bug. And I was pulled out of a history class. Except I didn't see the Johns Committee. I was called to the Dean of Women's office. And I was, you know, given the option of going to see the school psychiatrist to be cured, And then I could stay. But then other things began to happen. Yeah, they were going to let me stay in school, but they were going to pick my roommate, someone, the dean said, who was not susceptible.
I think there was a lot of probably misunderstanding. Those that were knowledgeable, there would be a small percentage who would see this as a very serious issue. There would be another percentage who would probably say, you know, it's sad, laughable, but sad, but it doesn't really affect my life day in, day out.
Art Copleston was a dorm advisor on campus. No one knew what he was going through.
I had no backup. I had nowhere to turn. I was strictly out there on my own. I had a secret that I had to protect at all costs, and I couldn't turn to anyone for help. That was the terror that was set up.
The Johns Committee kept tabs on hundreds of students at the University of Florida. Investigators asked Merrill Mushroom to be an informant for the committee. They never discovered that Merrill herself was a lesbian.
They started telling me about they're trying to help these people and that there are all these homos on campus, and some of them are students and some of them are faculty, and they're really very sick people and they need our help. And God, I wanted to throw up. It took me about 4 hours after that to decide that I was going to transfer to the University of Miami, like instantly at the end of the semester, because this was too scary and too nasty and too awful and too horrible.
Florida State University gave Julia the option of transferring to the University of Miami or being expelled. Julia chose Miami. The students who were forced to leave the University of Florida were not forgotten by their fellow classmates. The university's 1959 yearbook had a special dedication page, dedicated to those many students who for some reason leave the University of Florida never to return. The many tragedies at the university this year will never be forgotten or fully understood.
The entire state has to be embarrassed by what was produced in January 1964.
After spending 9 years investigating, the committee released a pamphlet entitled Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida.
They had positioned cameras in the men's rooms and had taken pictures in the men's rooms. And these are some, in fact, you see some of those in what we now call the infamous purple pamphlets. And I understand that it was selling as pornographic literature on the streets of New York in short order. And then it was quickly withdrawn. It wasn't widely circulated.
Support for the committee dwindled after the publication of the purple pamphlet.
This booklet was published and is presented to authorized people with the hope that it will better inform them as to the scope of homosexuality and the nature of it in the state of Florida. The printed matter on the final page of the book has been widely misunderstood and misinterpreted throughout the state.
Charley Johns resigned from the committee, and R.J. Strickland left his position as chief investigator. Lawmakers also began to withdraw their support for the committee's renewal.
I think the members of the committee are dedicated men and have striven to do a good job, but from the remarks that I've heard from members of the Senate, I feel that the reactivation of the committee is questionable.
When it was all over, more than 100 university professors and public school teachers lost their jobs. Hundreds of students were forced to leave university campuses. Johns retired from the state senate in 1966 and returned to the banking business in his hometown of Stark. Before his death in 1990, Johns said he didn't want to be known as the Charley Johns of the Johns Committee, but he also said he was proud of the committee's work. In his words, if the investigation saved one child from being made homosexual, it was justified.
I think that Charley Johns did this not to save Florida's children, but to save the political career of himself and of other pork choppers. Charley Johns left the committee after the uproar over the purple pamphlet really reached its crescendo. He realized that this was not the committee that he had started. also with the passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act in 1964, making attempts to preserve segregation a moot point, Johns realized that the committee had outlived its usefulness.
The overwhelming feeling that comes from something like that is an ingrained feeling of being less than satisfactory, being substandard, being not as good as straight people. I didn't feel this way before I met Mr. Tileston that night at the Burger House, ever. And I've felt this way ever since.
I can't say that I ever regretted anything I've ever done professionally. I worked very hard for 32 years in my profession. There were some things I would have liked to have changed, but I was not in any position to change those things, that being one of them.
It certainly taught me a tremendous amount about ways that people in power behave, and ways that people who I always had been taught were my friends are in fact my enemies.
No one should have the right to do that to another human being, much less hundreds of them. Most people in the United States don't even know what happened. I say the Johns Committee and the what? You know, and then I have to explain about this power-hungry redneck.
The balance sheet is simple. I've lost it all I lived for in my proud vanity, but I gained infinitely more in the love and proved devotion of my family, my co-workers, my friends, and my students. No money can buy that. I feel richer than gold. Now you've heard my Calvary in passion. I'm in the dock with bowed head, awaiting the verdict.
Hi, Allison, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person.
So we are lucky to have with us tonight Allison, who is one of the producers of the film, and I believe the primary workhorse behind putting it together and doing the research for that. So she's going to share a little bit with us about, kind of how it came to be and her experience putting it together. And then we will also turn the microphone over to Tamara to help move us through the rest of this program.
So you want me to start off? Is that okay?
Yes, please, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. Well, first off, it's an honor to be here. I'm glad that you all, I can't see your faces, but I'm glad that you decided to come out and see this film. It's been over 20 years now since it was made, which is sort of crazy to think about. I had never heard of the Johns Committee. I grew up in Alachua County. I'm from the small town of Alachua. I went to Santa Fe High School and then the University of Florida. And I had never heard of Charley Johns or the Johns Committee. And when I was at UF, I was enrolled in the master's program through the Documentary Institute, which no longer exists, sadly. But I had always been interested in history, and I was exploring historical topics related to Florida. And I came across a reading about Virgil Hawkins, who was the first African-American to gain admission to UF's law school. And at first I thought that would have been a great topic, and it would have been, but then I started doing some research and I found an article about how Virgil Hawkins and other members of the NAACP had been forced to be in Miami and testify in the basement of a building, and it was 95 degrees, and about their involvement with the NAACP and alleged communist ties. And I thought that, what is this Johns Committee that they're testifying in front of? And that just sort of led me down another trail. And fortunately, 2 graduate students at the University of South Florida and another place had written their master's thesis and their PhD dissertation on the Johns Committee. So that gave me some groundwork for that. And ironically, we're in 2021. The records were not supposed to be released until 2020, so last year. When I say the records, I mean the transcripts of the interrogations that took place. But there was a change to Florida's constitution in the early 90s. I think it was 93, if I'm remembering correctly. And so that meant that a lot of the records would then be released, and they were. And that's when graduate students and scholars, I think, decided to look into this and find out more about who was involved and the interrogations that took place. So that just opened up a wealth of information. And all of those records are still housed at the State Archives in Tallahassee. So I spent a lot of time there. And Jim Schnur, who's the historian that you saw in the documentary, he's one of the ones who's written extensively about this. So he was one of my main sources of information. Sadly, a lot of the people who are in the documentary have passed on. I am still in touch with Art Copleston. I just emailed with him earlier this week. He's 89 years old, still lives in California. When this was made in 1999, 2000, we interviewed him in 1999. We brought him back to campus. He'd not been back to UF since all of this happened, and he had graduated and moved on. His partner died of AIDS several years after this film was, came out. So anyway, it was just a very eye-opening experience for me. I could go on and talk about it. It's still very fresh in my mind, even though it's been over 20 years since I did the research and we did the interviews and put everything together. It's still, I get emails probably once a month or so from people who have found out about it. I still have the website I designed in 1999 up just because I kept it up, and so people find it that way. And the UF libraries reached out to me a couple of years ago about making it available online, digitizing it, which is great. So many people now are able to see it. So looking back on it now, there's so much I have learned about it since then, but this was a project for my master's degree. It was a project in lieu of thesis. So I feel as if, and I was looking at the exhibit that you all put together online, and it looks great. I know there's so many more photos now and other things that I could have included. I think probably there would have been more people willing to talk, even in that time period, there were definitely people who had been affected by it, who had been students at the time, who just weren't comfortable sharing. Art and Meryl and Penelope, Julia and Penelope were all very, very giving of their time. I will say I reached out to Sigmund Dietrich's family, and I spoke with his daughter who was living near Tampa at the time. And when I got her on the phone the first time, no one was home, and so she was more willing to talk. But she told me that her family was not aware of, or at least I believe her children were not aware of what had happened to their grandfather. And so that was interesting. When I called again to see if she would be willing to do an interview, she pretended like I was a telemarketer and told me never to call back. So, and I also attempted to interview Charley Johns' son, who was still alive. Charley Johns had passed on by this point, and his son worked at a bank in Stark, which is in Bradford County. And I had an interview all lined up, and then his secretary called and rescheduled it. And then she called again and canceled it. And so that never materialized. But the Matheson has been great with, we had a screening there initially, I guess maybe that was 2000 or 2001. And there was a lot of folks on campus with the libraries. All of the voicing that you heard Hank Connor, who's been around UF and Gainesville for a long time. He was the voice of Sigmund Dietrich. And those come from his letters. Those letters were written by Sigmund Dietrich and are in his papers in the special collections part of the UF library. So those were all written by him. He wrote them to a friend of his, a colleague in the geography department after all of this happened. So that was very, very helpful in learning more about what he went through, of course. So that's sort of how this all came about. And I'm just glad that there's still so much interest in it, because it is a part of history that wasn't told then. And I feel as if maybe it's been shared more widely during the past 30 years or so. But I feel that there's always going to be people who don't understand what happened or will be shocked to learn that it did happen. And it did also take place at FSU and USF, the University of South Florida. But by far the main target was the University of Florida. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to whoever else is there and wants to share.
Allyson, for sharing your work with us. And is this on? I don't think so. Okay. There we go. Allyson, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And thank you to the Matheson for hosting this event this evening. My name is Tamara Perry-Leonardo. I'm here on behalf of the Pride Community Center of North Central Florida. Hello and welcome, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I know we have some folks online too, so hello and thank you to you all as well. So we have, let's see, about 20 minutes to discuss and share thoughts and some perspectives on what we've learned this evening. And I think probably the easiest way to do that is to raise hands. So we'll do a little hand raising exercise. If you're comfortable participating, let's do an audience poll. I think it would be interesting, as Allyson mentioned, she had never even heard of, she grew up here, had never even heard of Charley Johns or any of this. I've been an active part of the Pride Center for the last 5 years. I have lived in Gainesville for the last 22 years as a student at the university. I had never heard of it. So I actually think it would be interesting to do a little audience poll. So raise your hands if you are just now learning about the Johns Committee. Okay, so we have like 5 in here or so. I'm not sure online if they want to participate. Okay, how about those who are already fairly knowledgeable about the Johns Committee? Maybe more like 10 or so. And how about those who were personally affected? Anybody who was personally affected by the Johns Committee? Nobody in this room will laugh at that. So we have some different, backgrounds and perspectives as far as our knowledge of what we've, the film, what we've seen. I want to start with what were you struck by? What impacts? I think some of the most, to me, the most emotionally impactful parts of the film were hearing the stories, the firsthand stories of those who were affected. And so wanted to kind of put out for the first question, what impact do you see either from this film or from those of you who have knowledge of the Johns Committee? What impacts do you see the Johns Committee created on its survivors or victims?
The most impactful thing that I saw is the gentleman who said that prior to that happening, his self-image was good, and ever since it happened, it is not. And I think that's just devastating that had that effect on him. And it was a long lasting effect. It wasn't just in that moment, it was for the rest of his life. It was horrifying.
Say that one of the questions that I have, it's unfortunate that we don't have as many stories as we could. But I wonder how many lives of people were affected by the Johns Committee because they were accused of homosexuality. What happened to us? Because one of the things that I said that I really learned about this for the first time today. The only time that I ever heard of the Johns Committee was from Chief Diversity Officer, who brought it up at a panel that I spoke on. And one of the questions from the audience was, what is the LGBTQ idea? And the reality is that at UF, they don't actually know. And the faculty, even today, still allow themselves to self-report or retract because of this long-standing history of the Johns Committee. And I think that's unfortunate because even though many people haven't heard of this committee today, we're still affected by it. I think there's a long legacy that's still affected.
Thanks for sharing that.
What you said about stories, but just think of like how many stories there are missing from the story and understanding that itself is and this is made 2020. I just recently made last year, so still in the new series, there's so many new series.
So a few years ago, I saw on WFT a second documentary about the Johns Committee that featured prominently Chuck Woods, a friend of mine who's now deceased, but was featured in the exhibit. I was curious if Allyson knows the people, the producer of that is a guy named Boaz Devere, D-V-I-R. Are you all aware of that, or is that resource also available? Because it's a very moving documentary. At the end, Chuck meets up with the PD officer who arrested him and interrogated him. And it's quite a moving moment of closure. Is that a resource that's available, or would anyone know how to access that?
So
It's got from all along.
that is a documentary that was put together by the University of Central Florida. So that is available through their PBS station. So it is available online.
Oh, great. Okay.
I'm happy using your contact information. I'm happy to share that.
Yeah, I got this in the beginning. I only saw the last 10 minutes, but it was with people looking up. And Chuck is captured quite eloquently on there. Yeah, I knew him as a detective at the university, and I was shocked. You know, I turned on my TV one Saturday, and there he is talking about this, and I thought, oh my gosh, he lied about being homosexual just in order to keep his job. And I felt so badly for him, and gained new respect for him, because he never ever talked about that in the time that I knew him and worked with him. He's quite a remarkable person, and I encourage all of you to look up that thing.
Chuck Woods was also he was, I think Caitlin could speak to this better than I can, but I think he was a major contributor to the information in this exhibit. There are clips of him on the online version of the exhibit. And Chuck Woods also was an incredibly important benefactor to the Pride Center, where we're indebted to this day to his legacy. So thanks for mentioning that. So let's talk about parallels that we saw that are parallels then to today. I noticed several phrases and things pricked my ears that I'm curious what parallels you all saw to the current to our current climate. In the back?
Yes. First, I became aware of the Johns Committee through the exhibit here at Matheson a number of months ago. Who here up here in Maine, was not aware of it. My mother did work at the University of Florida as a secretary for Nancy Gallo back in the 50s and 60s when I asked her about it, and she remembers some details about it. But related to the question, actually I was thinking about that as the program was going on, is that it seems like a certain group of people that are in power like to retain power, and they like to marginalize. And so there's certain white Anglo-Saxon Protestant beliefs that if you don't believe or fall outside of their view of that belief, then you somehow get marginalized and they try to take power away from you, like voting rights. So that's kind of what struck me. Today, the people in Tallahassee are using trans people to make themselves stronger. And we have a party at present power and party who believes in bullying and wants to take people's minds off of what is important and wants people not to see what they're really doing. When they attack from this vulnerable. And what the people went through with the Johnson, imagine the new trans today. This thing. And this is just the beginning. The Republican people in the state legislature have their way. Pretty soon, any of us who are one of the letters of LGBT are in danger. And this is, to me, this is a very scary time. And this is a time where we can't go in the closet. We have to come out shouting. We have to stop this business. We have to stop it. And that's not the goal. We do not stand by it.
Thank you. I think that ties into what Kate was saying earlier, as far as the silence being, there not being stories being so impactful, and I think that's exactly counter, right? To, that's a big part of how we stop things like this from happening again, is not being silent. Thanks for sharing that. Sam also, he called out the trans, the attack on trans people, and that was something that I noticed as well, and even some of the language I noticed, predators, the whole bathroom nonsense, right? Using that language of predators and keeping our children safe, and all the same kind of phrases that we were hearing in this film. I feel like we've heard in the last few years, but the focus has shifted to our trans family. There are some hands back here in the black.
Roots went to me, especially for the last year and a half, was the threat of the administration in Florida, withholding state funding for the university system, that they do not comply, and the president, as the invisible, who is either unwilling or in allowing their faculty, staff, and students.
Yeah, wanted to go off again of what you said. I would say another, I'm a student at UF right now. I would say another parallel that is very evident to us at UF, or to the fortunate students at UF, is the complacency within our current administration at UF and the administration we saw in the films, just for tolerating. A popular idea right now at UF is, how do we address some of the buildings we have that are named after people that we've seen in this documentary, such as Julius Wainwright and also Stephen Hawkins. How can we, or why doesn't our administration really do anything to address the legacy that these people have had on students, past and present? And why are they complacent? They just allow this history to go unacknowledged. I urge you.
I think it was coherent. We hear both.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I saw heads nodding. Anyone else? Yeah, gotcha.
I recently graduated also, and I think there's this maintenance of things that was in the past, but stuff is still happening on campus like that. You're a student organizer fighting for any kind of justice, and you're doing everything you can to try to stop. Still, the president of the university makes $7 million a year, and the endowment is $4 billion, and prison labor is also through corporations. The university doesn't have a huge method now, 30 years later. But I think it's important also to know where the money's coming from, and also the university knows that kids will graduate in 4 years and then they don't have to be mad at them anymore about certain things, and they can use that to grant student organizers. I don't know, that has a really big impact on Gainesville too, but it's not only stuff goes on. Yeah, we can talk about all the impacts of the gentrification impact result in diversity for many other nations that can still impact folks down here, even if they're not invested in students. Or other marginalized that have a lot to do with the folks who are back then and their legacy, or people who are communists. That's kind of still present, unfortunately. I mean, it's a little bit less immigrants. So the covert stuff, we got lots of people.
happens, or long-term measures that are supposed to be addressing inequities and really is when you the administration hire diversity officers and establish communities that actually look at what they're doing, there's a clear example. There's been a task force for the past so it's like they hear the message and they're like, oh, something.
And then also going back to stories, but that's just like another side of the coin, just like trying to erase the stuff that the bad stuff that we did in the past, and we just go, that's in the past. Instead of try it out on and to learn from these things. But kind of like legacy are we doing the support and keeping things.
We have just a couple minutes left, so I'm going to kind of wrap up with hearing your thoughts on where do we go from here. We can see some areas where we have progressed. I thought it was interesting that the police officer mentioned they were Miranda rights. So even something like that is different today. Certainly we're standing here having this conversation. That's different today. But let's, I think it'd be nice if we spent our last few minutes together talking through what are some, not to pat ourselves on the back what's different today, but what are our strengths today? Where can we leverage what we have now? What I'm kind of hearing all of the undertones of what I was hearing was there's a power, right? It's like a power situation. It's a power dynamic. It was then and it is now. Where are areas of strength now in our community that we see? How can we make positive strides where stories aren't covered and people aren't persecuted? Certainly not something that this little group of us in the Launcher Camp is going to handle all ourselves, but what kind of takeaways do you have about ways that, either personally or in this small community that we could make some positive impacts?
One of the most important tools that we have today is and I think one of the problems with power dynamics is that people who need to be heard are not heard. And having all these tools at our disposal, you can really make a difference by raising the voices of people who saw that with the Black Lives Matter, what that too. I think I'm really grateful to this documentary maker for making this film. I really wish to see more likely. The fact that we had a Supreme Court case not too long ago about whether gay people didn't find jobs. It's shocking to have in 2020. And I think this story needs to be told because this thing happens and came very close to happening again. So we need to raise the voices of people even from the past.
I agree. I think this needs to be shared with a broader audience. The community needs to hear this that has not heard this because they're not aware, they're not thinking about this. I think having putting it on their table for them to think about is something that would be useful for them to use this kind of thing.
So sharing stories of the past. What do you think about sharing stories today? You know, or do you feel like there are ways we can do better at, like you said, amplifying voices that don't get heard? Yes.
Well, the adage of we must learn from the past and we're bound to repeat the same mistakes is true today as it ever was. But we can look at their own lifetimes, our families, our grandparents in the 30s, which is probably still reachable within our memory banks, that we are seeing these. This is 20 years ago, but it could be today because the state legislature, Republican dominated for decades, has now had such a grasp on power that the effort to silence people runs counter to what the message that we need to see voices, hear voices, and they much prefer to have them silenced. So speaking out, political power takes organizing, commitment, and real leadership. We do not have the leaders of getting that power because of gerrymandering, dark money, et cetera, et cetera. So these are familiar stories that we hear, but it takes action. In this coming year, it is probably as vital any year in our life because it is the present.
Final thoughts in the room or online? Yeah.
Just, you know, the LGBTQ community is really powerful, way more powerful than we use for power. It is known that LGBTQ folks can be wealthier than their heterosexual people. They spend a lot more. They can be very vocal. Key is we have to come together as LGBTQ people. And somehow it seems to me a little bit, we've kind of gone into labels where we have so many labels. We just go, what has happened to us? We need to get back together and we need to sing a song together. We need to protect our trans people right now as they're being attacked. We need to take care of our bi people. We need to take care of all of our people without concern of what label they happen to be. They're a part of the LGBTQ community, period. And we've got to get together. And a lot of us have become very complacent. Once marriage, the right to marry came about, there are many folks who have done, well, we made it. That can't be the end goal. Because that can be taken away just as any other right. And so we need to pay attention to the next election. We need to pay attention to every election. But we need to be out and proud at the polls. People need to know that yes, we voted.
I would also just tack on to that. I think that that even though the LGBTQ plus community may, statistically be a minority, the allied community is not. There are a lot more people who, given the choice, would be more interested in equality than not. There are more allies, even if they are lazy and complacent allies, than there are non-allies. But I think, to your point, Sam, like mobilizing and pulling together, or to your point, I'm sorry, about mobilizing and Sam getting loud. I think that we have to make sure that we are waking and shaking our ally friends as well, because I think with those groups, that is a level place, right? That's what makes me think important here. So we're the foods we eat our friends. So, were there any comments or questions online?
There was one question about why people were able to transfer to the University of Miami? Was it because it was a private school?
I think that would be a question for Allyson. Do you
So
know,
yeah,
Allyson?
obviously the University of Miami was private, it still is private, and the thought was the committee didn't really have any power there. They would have no resources. For instance, the University of Florida hired police officers, or the committee hired University of Florida police officers to help them with the interrogation. I did put this in the chat, though I don't know if you all can see this. Julia Penelope, when I interviewed her, shared the story of how she was supposed to, you either needed to live with your family or live on campus, and she didn't live with her family because she had a bad home life, and she moved in with a boy. And there was actually a rule at the University of Miami that said males and females students should not live together. And she did, and she was reported by a neighbor to the University of Miami. And so she was disciplined for that, which she always thought was ironic because obviously she didn't have a relationship with this young man because she was a lesbian, but so she had to kind of fly under the radar with her living situation there. But yeah, that was basically, at the time there was only the 3 public universities and then the University of Miami. So a lot of students transferred there because it was deemed as a way to still finish your education. And the committee really had no jurisdiction, I guess, if you will. They didn't rely on state funds, of course, so there was no threat to sort of cave into the pressure of cooperating with the lawmakers, the legislative committee. And Julia's, I was going to say, sadly, Julia passed away a few years ago. Meryl Mushroom does still live in Tennessee. And Meryl Mushroom, when I interviewed her, she literally lived in a house that there was an outhouse. There was no running. They now have running water and a toilet inside, but even in the late 90s, her and her husband chose to get married years before so they could adopt children. She was a lesbian, he was a gay man, and no one in the town in Tennessee at the time when we did the interview, they just assumed it was just this married couple that had adopted foster kids over the years. And I forgot how many kids they had adopted over the years, but all of these people they went on, they didn't let this define them, what happened to them. All 3 of them, Art, Meryl, and Julia, had successful professional and personal lives. And so I'm thankful for that. And I'm thankful that I'm still in touch with Art. He's very involved politically in the Democratic Party in California, but he said he's slowing down now because he just turned 89 last month, and he said he doesn't see as well and get around as well. But anyway, so that was to answer. It was probably a long answer to your question. Sorry about that.
Well, we're about out of time, so I just want to thank you again, Allyson. Thank you, Caitlin and Matheson, and thank you all for being here and engaging and being a part of the discussion and being part of the work that we have ahead of us. Thank you.